I was 68 years old when I discovered that the people I trusted most in this world had been systematically robbing me blind for over 3 years. My name is Eleanor Martinez, and I've lived in the same ranch-style house in Phoenix, Arizona for 42 years. I raised 4 children in this home, buried my husband Robert here in 2019, and thought I knew everything there was to know about family loyalty. I was wrong about that last part. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered by the most unlikely messenger imaginable. My 10-year-old grandson Marcus, my daughter Patricia's youngest boy, had been staying with me for the week while his parents attended what they called an important business conference in Las Vegas. Marcus was always a quiet child, thoughtful beyond his years, with those serious brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. That morning, he appeared in my kitchen doorway, clutching his tablet against his chest like it contained state secrets. I was making pancakes, the same recipe I'd used for decades, when Marcus cleared his throat in that formal way children do when they're about to say something they know will change everything. His small voice barely carried across the kitchen as he spoke the words that would shatter my understanding of my own family. Marcus told me he had been recording his parents for weeks. Not the innocent kind of recording that children sometimes do when they're playing with technology, but deliberate, purposeful documentation of conversations he knew were wrong. He said he'd started doing it after overhearing his father David mention my name during a heated phone call about money, about accounts, about things that made Marcus uncomfortable even though he didn't fully understand what they meant. The night before his parents left for Vegas, Marcus had hidden in the hallway outside their bedroom with his tablet recording. What he captured was a 23-minute conversation between Patricia and David that outlined their systematic theft of my finances in stunning detail. They discussed bank accounts I didn't know they had access to, credit cards opened in my name, retirement funds they'd been siphoning, and property transactions I'd never authorized. As Marcus played the recording for me, sitting at my kitchen table with his small hands wrapped around a glass of orange juice, I felt the same sensation I'd experienced when the doctor told me Robert had cancer. That peculiar lightness in your head when reality shifts so dramatically that your brain can't quite process what's happening. Patricia's voice came through the tablet speakers with crystal clarity, discussing dollar amounts that represented my life savings, my security, my future. My daughter's voice was matter-of-fact as she told her husband about the latest transfer she'd made from my checking account to theirs. She mentioned forging my signature on documents, using my social security number to open new accounts, and even selling some of my late husband's tools and collectibles without my knowledge. David's responses were equally cold, focused entirely on logistics and timing, treating my financial devastation like a business transaction. The most heartbreaking part wasn't the theft itself, though that was devastating enough. It was listening to my own daughter discuss me like I was already dead, like I was just an inconvenient obstacle between them and money they felt entitled to. Patricia referred to me as becoming more manageable as I aged, easier to manipulate, less likely to ask detailed questions about my finances. They talked about my grief over Robert's death as an opportunity, a time when I was too distracted to pay attention to bank statements or unusual charges. Marcus sat quietly while I listened to the entire recording twice. His young face was etched with worry, not just about what his parents had done, but about how I would react to learning the truth. When the recording ended, he looked at me with those serious brown eyes and asked if I was going to be okay. At that moment, I realized this 10-year-old boy had shown more courage and integrity than my own adult children. I asked Marcus why he'd decided to record his parents, and his answer broke my heart all over again. He said he'd noticed that I seemed sad lately, more worried than usual, especially when opening mail or talking on the phone about money. He'd heard his parents whispering about me when they thought he wasn't listening, using words like opportunity and while we still can, that made him uncomfortable. Marcus told me he knew something was wrong but didn't understand what, so he decided to find out. The recording Marcus made revealed that this wasn't a recent development. Patricia and David had been systematically accessing my accounts since shortly after Robert's funeral 3 years ago. They'd started small, testing whether I would notice minor discrepancies, then gradually escalated to larger and more frequent thefts. They'd used my grief and my trust in them to gain access to financial information, bank cards, and important documents. According to their conversation, they'd taken over $47,000 from my various accounts over the past 3 years. They'd also sold Robert's vintage watch collection, his fishing equipment, and several pieces of furniture when I was visiting my sister in California last Christmas. The money from these sales went directly to their personal accounts, funding what David called their lifestyle improvements. The sophistication of their scheme was stunning. They'd researched elder financial abuse techniques, studied how to avoid triggering bank security measures, and even consulted with someone David referred to as quote, 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 and my name using my excellent credit score, maxed them out for cash advances, then made minimum payments to keep the accounts in good standing while I remained unaware they existed. Patricia had been the mastermind, using her position as my primary emergency contact and healthcare proxy to gain access to sensitive information. She'd convinced me to add her name to several accounts, just in case something happened, then used that access to slowly drain my resources. The cruelest part was how she'd used my love for my grandchildren as leverage, frequently asking for money for Marcus and his older sister Emma's school expenses, sports equipment, and activities that I later learned they'd never purchased. After hearing the recording, I sat in my kitchen for nearly an hour trying to process what I'd learned. Marcus stayed with me, occasionally patting my hand in that comforting way children do when they sense adults are in distress. He told me he'd been carrying this secret for weeks, torn between loyalty to his parents and concern for me. He'd finally decided that protecting me was more important than protecting them. I called my sister Margaret first, needing someone to help me think through my options. Margaret lived in Tucson and had always been skeptical of Patricia's frequent requests for money and her sudden interest in managing my affairs after Robert died. When I told her what Marcus had discovered, there was a long silence before Margaret said she'd been waiting for this call for months. Margaret drove to Phoenix that same day, bringing her laptop and a legal pad filled with notes she'd been keeping about Patricia's suspicious behavior. She'd noticed changes in my spending patterns during our phone calls, heard worry in my voice about money that didn't match my historically stable financial situation, and observed Patricia's increasingly expensive lifestyle, despite David's modest income as a warehouse supervisor. Together, Margaret and I spent the afternoon going through my financial records, bank statements, and credit reports. The full scope of the theft became clear as we traced unauthorized transactions, discovered unknown accounts, and identified forged signatures on FreeUO.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Documents I'd never seen. The systematic nature of the fraud was overwhelming, but having concrete evidence made it impossible to dismiss what Marcus had revealed. Margaret helped me understand that this wasn't just a family problem but a serious crime that required legal intervention. The amounts stolen, the length of time involved, and the sophisticated methods used elevated this beyond simple financial disagreement between relatives. We were looking at elder abuse, identity theft, fraud, and potentially money laundering, depending on how they'd processed the stolen funds. That evening, while Marcus watched cartoons in the living room, Margaret and I developed a plan of action. We needed to secure my remaining assets, document all the theft, report the crimes to appropriate authorities, and confront Patricia and David with evidence they couldn't deny or explain away. Most importantly, we needed to protect Marcus and Emma from the inevitable family explosion that would follow. I spent a sleepless night thinking about how I'd missed the signs of what was happening. Looking back, there had been red flags I'd ignored or rationalized away. Patricia's sudden interest in my financial planning, her insistence on helping with my banking, her frequent questions about my account balances and investment portfolios, David's new truck, their kitchen renovation, Emma's private school tuition that they'd somehow managed despite their limited income. The next morning, I called my bank and requested an emergency meeting with a manager. I brought Marcus's recording, printed copies of unauthorized transactions, and a list of accounts I suspected had been compromised. The bank manager, a professional woman named Sarah Chen, listened to portions of the recording with increasing alarm. She immediately froze all my accounts and initiated fraud investigations for each suspicious transaction. Sarah explained that elder financial abuse was unfortunately common, and that banks had specific protocols for handling these situations. She connected me with their fraud department and helped me file formal reports for each compromised account. The bank security team would review surveillance footage from times when Patricia had visited branches claiming to help me with transactions, providing additional evidence of her unauthorized access. While at the bank, I also discovered that Patricia had attempted to change the beneficiaries on several of my accounts, listing herself and David as primary recipients instead of my 4 children equally. She'd forged my signature on beneficiary change forms just 2 months earlier, during a period when I'd been recovering from minor surgery and relying on her help with errands and appointments. The most disturbing discovery came when Sarah showed me application documents for a home equity line of credit that Patricia had opened using my house as collateral. I'd never applied for or authorized this credit line, but someone had forged my signature and used my personal information to access $25,000 against my home's value. The money had been transferred to an account I'd never seen, held jointly by Patricia and David. Margaret accompanied me to the Phoenix Police Department, where we filed a formal complaint against Patricia and David for elder abuse, identity theft, and fraud. The detective assigned to the case, a patient woman named Detective Jennifer Walsh, explained that these crimes were taken seriously by Arizona law enforcement, and that the evidence we'd provided was substantial enough to warrant immediate investigation. Detective Walsh was particularly interested in Marcus's recording, calling it unprecedented evidence in an elder abuse case. Most financial abuse cases rely on paper trails and victim testimony, but having audio documentation of the perpetrators discussing their crimes in detail provided prosecutors with unusually strong evidence. She assured me that Marcus would be protected throughout the legal process and that his brave actions had potentially saved me from losing everything. The detective explained that financial elder abuse often escalates over time, with perpetrators becoming bolder and more aggressive as they gain confidence in their methods. Based on Patricia and David's recorded conversation, they were planning to accelerate their theft in the coming months, potentially attempting to force me into assisted living while they gained complete control of my assets. Over the next several days, Detective Walsh worked with bank investigators to trace the stolen funds and identify all fraudulent accounts. The investigation revealed that Patricia and David had been more systematic than even their recording suggested. They'd created a sophisticated network of accounts and shell companies to launder the stolen money, making it appear legitimate for tax purposes. They'd used some of the stolen funds to purchase investment properties in David's name, claiming rental income that was actually my money being cycled through fake lease agreements. They'd opened business accounts for a consulting company that existed only on paper, using it to legitimize large cash deposits taken from my retirement accounts. The week Patricia and David returned from Las Vegas, Detective Walsh and I decided to confront them together at their home. I insisted on being present for this conversation, despite the detective's concerns about my emotional well-being. I needed to look my daughter in the eyes and hear her explanation for betraying me so completely. Marcus and Emma were at school when we arrived at Patricia's house on a Thursday afternoon. Patricia answered the door with a bright smile that immediately faded when she saw Detective Walsh's badge. David appeared behind her, his face going pale as he recognized that their secret was no longer secret. Detective Walsh allowed me to speak first, and I played portions of Marcus's recording for them on my phone. Watching their faces change as they heard their own voices discussing my financial destruction was both satisfying and heartbreaking. Patricia began crying immediately. Not from remorse, but from the realization that they'd been caught. David's reaction was more aggressive, initially denying that the voices on the recording were theirs, then claiming the conversation had been taken out of context. He accused me of manipulating Marcus into spying on them, of turning their son against his own parents. His anger quickly shifted to panic when Detective Walsh began reading the formal charges being filed against them. Patricia's defense was more manipulative, appealing to my emotions as a mother and grandmother. She claimed they'd only borrowed the money temporarily, that they'd planned to pay everything back once David's business took off. She insisted they'd never meant to hurt me, that they were just trying to provide better opportunities for their children. The conversation became increasingly heated as David realized the severity of their legal situation. He blamed Patricia for initiating the scheme, claimed he'd been reluctant to participate, and even suggested that I was becoming senile and had given them permission to access my accounts. Detective Walsh cut short his protests by presenting bank records showing his signature on fraudulent documents dating back 3 years. Patricia's tears turned to anger as she accused me of destroying her family over money. She claimed I was being vindictive, using the legal system to punish them for trying to secure their children's future. She said I had more money than I needed anyway, that Robert would have wanted his grandchildren to benefit from his hard work. The most painful moment came when Patricia demanded to know how I'd discovered their activities. When I explained that Marcus had recorded them, her reaction was immediate and vicious. She accused her 10-year-old son of betrayal, called him manipulative and sneaky, and threatened to punish him for violating their privacy. In that moment, I saw clearly the kind of parents Marcus and Emma were living with. Detective Walsh ended the confrontation by formally arresting Patricia and David on charges of elder abuse, identity theft, fraud, and money laundering. As they were handcuffed and led away, Patricia screamed at me that I was destroying my own family, that I'd never see my grandchildren again, that I'd die alone and forgotten. David's parting words were threats about legal retaliation, claims that they'd fight the charges and prove my mental incompetence. He said they'd been protecting me from my own poor financial decisions, that everything they'd done was for my benefit. Even facing arrest, neither of them showed genuine remorse for their actions. After Patricia and David were taken away, I sat in their driveway for several minutes, processing what had just happened. I had reported my own daughter to the police. I'd destroyed my grandchildren's family stability. I'd chosen justice over family harmony, and the weight of that decision was crushing. Margaret, who had been waiting in the car during the confrontation, helped me understand that I'd made the only ethical choice available. Patricia and David had made their own decisions when they chose to systematically steal from me. My responsibility was to protect myself and ensure they faced consequences for their crimes, not to enable their criminal behavior for the sake of family peace. The immediate aftermath was complicated by concerns about Marcus and Emma's welfare. With both parents in custody, Child Protective Services needed to arrange temporary guardianship. I volunteered to take both children, but the system required extensive background checks and home evaluations before approving kinship placement. Fortunately, Margaret was approved as an emergency guardian, and both children came to stay with me while the legal process unfolded. Marcus was remarkably resilient, seeming almost relieved that the secret he'd been carrying was finally out in the open. Emma, who was 13 and more aware of the implications, struggled with anger and confusion about her parents' arrest. Explaining the situation to Emma was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. She'd been completely unaware of her parents' criminal activities and couldn't understand why I'd chosen to involve the police, rather than handling the matter privately within the family. She accused me of being cruel and vindictive, of caring more about money than about keeping the family together. It took weeks of patient explanation and counseling support before Emma began to understand that her parents' actions were crimes, not family disagreements. She gradually came to see that my decision to report them was about protecting other potential victims and ensuring justice, not about revenge or financial greed. Marcus, despite his young age, seemed to grasp the moral complexities of the situation more clearly than his older sister. He told me he was proud of himself for recording his parents and glad that I was safe from their schemes. He said he'd been worried about me for months and felt better knowing that the truth was finally out. The legal process moved forward with remarkable speed due to the strength of the evidence. Patricia and David's recorded conversation provided prosecutors with their own confession, making plea negotiations the most practical path forward. Their defense attorneys advised them to cooperate with investigators and accept responsibility for their crimes. During discovery, we learned that the total amount stolen was actually higher than initially calculated. Including the home equity fraud, credit card theft, and proceeds from selling Robert's belongings, Patricia and David had taken nearly $63,000 over 3 years. They'd also damaged my credit score by missing payments on fraudulent accounts and accumulated additional debt in my name. Patricia accepted a plea bargain first, agreeing to serve 18 months in county jail in exchange for full cooperation with asset recovery efforts. She provided bank account information, identified hidden assets, and admitted to the full scope of their criminal activities. Her cooperation was crucial in tracing money that had been transferred to various accounts and investments. David initially fought the charges, claiming he'd been coerced by Patricia into participating in the scheme. However, bank records clearly showed his active participation in opening fraudulent accounts and making unauthorized withdrawals. When prosecutors threatened to add charges related to the business accounts and property purchases, David also accepted a plea bargain for 24 months in state prison. The sentencing hearing was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Both Patricia and David made statements acknowledging their crimes and apologizing for their actions. Patricia's tears seemed genuine as she expressed remorse for betraying my trust and damaging our family relationships. David's apology focused more on the impact on his children than on the harm he'd caused me. I was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement at the sentencing. Standing in that courtroom, looking at my daughter in an orange jumpsuit, I struggled to find words that could convey the depth of betrayal I felt. I spoke about the sleepless nights, the anxiety about my financial security, the violation of trust that had shattered my faith in family bonds. More importantly, I spoke about the impact on Marcus and Emma, who were losing their parents to criminal behavior and would carry this trauma throughout their lives. I explained how their crimes had forced me to choose between being a victim and being an advocate for justice, a choice no parent should have to make regarding their own children. The judge was clearly moved by the case's family dynamics, but emphasized that elder financial abuse was a serious crime with lasting consequences for victims. She noted that my age and vulnerability made Patricia and David's actions particularly reprehensible, and that the systematic nature of their theft showed criminal intent rather than momentary poor judgment. Patricia received her 18-month sentence with eligibility for early release after 12 months if she completed financial responsibility courses and maintained steady employment while incarcerated. David received the full 24-month sentence due to his initial lack of cooperation and his role in the more sophisticated aspects of the fraud. Recovery of the stolen assets became a complex process involving multiple financial institutions, property seizures, and asset liquidation. Some money had already been spent on non-recoverable items like vacations and luxury purchases. But investigators were able to trace and freeze most of the stolen funds and assets purchased with my money. The house they'd bought with stolen funds was put up for sale, with proceeds going directly to my restitution account. Their vehicles, which had been financed using fraudulent loans in my name, were repossessed and sold. Even David's business equipment and Patricia's jewelry collection were evaluated for potential recovery value. Margaret helped me work with a financial recovery specialist who dealt specifically with elder abuse cases. This expert assisted in rebuilding my credit score, closing fraudulent accounts, and implementing security measures to prevent future unauthorized access to my finances. The recovery process was lengthy but ultimately successful in restoring most of my financial stability. The emotional recovery was more challenging than the financial aspects. I struggled with feelings of guilt about sending my own daughter to prison, even though I intellectually understood that she'd made her own choices. Family members were divided about my decision to prosecute, with some believing I should have handled the matter privately. My other children, Patricia's siblings, had mixed reactions to the situation. Two of them supported my decision completely, understanding that criminal behavior requires legal consequences regardless of family relationships. My youngest son initially blamed me for being too trusting and not monitoring my finances more carefully, though he eventually came to see that victim blaming was inappropriate. The most healing aspect of this entire ordeal was my relationship with Marcus and Emma. Living with them while their parents served their sentences allowed us to build stronger bonds than we'd ever had before. Marcus's courage in exposing his parents' crimes continued to inspire me, and Emma gradually came to understand that justice and love could coexist. Marcus never expressed regret about recording his parents or telling me the truth. He said he learned that doing the right thing sometimes means making difficult choices that hurt people you love. His maturity in handling such complex moral situations at age 10 gave me hope for his future character and values. Emma's journey was more difficult, but watching her process the situation and eventually understand the importance of accountability was remarkably moving. She wrote letters to her parents in prison expressing her disappointment in their choices while maintaining her love for them as people. Her ability to separate their criminal actions from their parental relationship showed wisdom beyond her years. As Patricia and David's sentences progressed, I had to decide whether to maintain contact with them during their incarceration. After much consideration and counseling, I chose to write to them occasionally, focusing on updates about the children rather than rehashing their crimes or my feelings about their betrayal. Patricia's responses to my letters showed gradual acceptance of responsibility for her actions and genuine remorse for the pain she'd caused. She expressed gratitude that I was caring for her children and acknowledged that her criminal behavior had destroyed the trust that family relationships require. Her growth during incarceration gave me hope for eventual reconciliation. David's letters were more focused on legal appeals and complaints about prison conditions. While he eventually stopped denying his crimes, he never seemed to fully grasp the emotional impact of his actions on me or his children. His lack of genuine remorse made me doubt whether he'd learned anything meaningful from his experience. The ripple effects of this situation extended far beyond our immediate family. Other elderly members of our community began examining their own financial arrangements more carefully after hearing about my case. Several discovered suspicious activities by adult children or caregivers, leading to additional investigations and prosecutions. Detective Walsh told me that Marcus's recording had been used as a training tool for other officers investigating elder abuse cases. The clear evidence it provided helped prosecutors understand how to build stronger cases against financial predators who target vulnerable seniors. Marcus's bravery had protected not just me but potentially many other victims. As the first year after Patricia and David's arrests came to an end, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. I'd lost my naive trust in family loyalty, but gained a deeper understanding of true courage and integrity. Marcus had shown me that age doesn't determine wisdom, and that sometimes the youngest voices speak the most important truths. My financial security had been restored, but more importantly, I'd learned to advocate for myself and others in similar situations. I began speaking at community centers about elder financial abuse, sharing my story to help other seniors recognize warning signs and understand their options for seeking help. The house that had once felt like a refuge became a symbol of resilience and new beginnings. Marcus and Emma filled it with laughter and activity that had been missing since Robert's death. Their presence reminded me daily that family isn't just about blood relationships, but about people who choose to protect and support each other. Margaret's unwavering support throughout this ordeal strengthened our sisterly bond in ways I hadn't expected. Her practical assistance with legal and financial matters was crucial, but her emotional support helped me maintain my sanity during the darkest moments of betrayal and loss. Looking ahead to Patricia and David's eventual release from prison, I knew that rebuilding our family relationships would be complicated and might ultimately be impossible. Trust, once shattered so completely, doesn't repair easily or quickly, but I remained open to the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation if they demonstrated genuine change and commitment to making amends. The most important lesson I learned from this experience was that protecting yourself from harm isn't selfish or vindictive, even when the harm comes from family members. Enabling criminal behavior by staying silent doesn't help anyone involved, and often leads to escalated abuse of other vulnerable people. Marcus taught me that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful messages. His decision to record his parents and share the truth with me saved my financial future and probably prevented them from victimizing other elderly relatives or family friends. As I write this story, Marcus is 11 years old and continues to live with me while his parents complete their sentences. Emma has started her freshman year of high school and seems to be thriving despite the upheaval in her family situation. Both children have received counseling to help them process their parents, crimes, and the impact on their family structure. The legal proceedings officially concluded, with both Patricia and David making full restitution payments from the seized assets and their prison work earnings. The total financial recovery exceeded 90% of the stolen amounts, a remarkably successful outcome for an elder abuse case. More importantly, the emotional healing continues daily through small moments of trust, honesty, and genuine care between family members who chose to do the right thing despite personal cost. Marcus's courage opened the door to justice, but our collective commitment to rebuilding with integrity will determine our family's future. This experience taught me that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, to demand justice, and to protect others from harm. Age brings vulnerability in some ways, but it also brings wisdom, perspective, and the moral authority to insist on accountability from those who would take advantage of trust and love. The morning Patricia was scheduled for release, I woke up at 4:30 with my stomach in knots. 18 months had passed since that terrible day when Detective Walsh led my daughter away in handcuffs, and I still wasn't sure how I felt about seeing her again. Marcus, now 12 and somehow even more thoughtful than before, found me sitting at the kitchen table with my untouched coffee, staring out at the desert sunrise. He didn't say anything at first, just poured himself a glass of orange juice and sat down across from me. Emma had already left for her morning run, a new habit she'd developed during her sophomore year that helped her process stress. At 16, she'd grown into a remarkable young woman who spoke her mind but also listened with genuine empathy when others needed support. Marcus finally broke the silence with a question that had been weighing on all of us. He asked if I thought his mother had really changed, if prison had taught her anything meaningful about the pain she'd caused. His voice carried a mixture of hope and skepticism that seemed far too mature for someone who should be worried about middle school homework and soccer practice. I told him honestly that I didn't know what to expect from Patricia. Her letters over the past months had shown what seemed like genuine remorse and self-reflection. But words on paper were different from face-to-face accountability. We'd all learned that people could say whatever they thought others wanted to hear, especially when they were facing consequences for their actions. The halfway house, where Patricia would be spending her first 3 months of supervised release, was located in Tempe, about 20 miles from my house. She'd found work at a nonprofit organization that helped women transition back into society after incarceration, a position that required her to pass extensive background checks and demonstrate genuine commitment to rehabilitation. Margaret had driven down from Tucson the night often escalates because perpetrators become addicted to the sense of control and the lifestyle improvements that stolen money provides. The most difficult part of our conversation involved Patricia's acknowledgement that she'd manipulated my grief over Robert's death to gain access to my finances. She admitted that she'd deliberately encouraged my emotional dependence on her during that vulnerable time, using my sorrow as a tool to justify increasingly invasive involvement in my personal affairs. Emma asked the question that had been bothering her most throughout her mother's incarceration. She wanted to know how Patricia could have looked at her own children every day while stealing their grandmother's security, knowing that her crimes would eventually devastate the entire family structure they depended on. Patricia's answer was painfully honest. She said she'd convinced herself that she was protecting her children's future by taking money that would eventually be theirs anyway through inheritance. She'd rationalized that stealing from me was actually securing Marcus and Emma's college funds, their opportunities for advancement, their protection against financial instability. This justification had allowed her to avoid confronting the reality that she was committing crimes against someone who loved and trusted her. She'd created an elaborate mental framework that cast her theft as maternal sacrifice rather than betrayal of the most fundamental family bonds. Marcus listened to his mother's explanations with the same serious attention he'd shown when recording her criminal conversations 18 months earlier. When she finished speaking, he asked whether she understood that her actions had taught him not to trust the adults who were supposed to protect him. The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Patricia began crying again, but these tears seemed different from her earlier emotional display. She acknowledged that her crimes had stolen more than money from our family. They'd taken away Marcus and Emma's sense of security in their own home and their confidence that the people they loved most would always act in their best interests. Margaret, who had remained silent throughout most of this conversation, finally spoke up to ask about Patricia's plans for making genuine amends beyond simply serving her court-ordered sentence. She pointed out that rebuilding trust would require consistent actions over time, not just emotional conversations about remorse and personal growth. Patricia had clearly thought about this question extensively. She outlined a detailed plan for financial restitution that went beyond the court-mandated payments, including her commitment to turn over all earnings from her halfway house job until she'd repaid every cent of the stolen money plus interest calculated at current market rates. She'd also arranged to attend ongoing counseling sessions with a therapist who specialized in family reconciliation after financial abuse. Patricia understood that her children needed professional support to process their trauma, and that any hope for restored family relationships would require mediated conversations with neutral therapeutic guidance. The most significant commitment Patricia made was to complete transparency about her finances going forward. She agreed to provide monthly statements from all her bank accounts, to avoid any involvement in my financial affairs even in advisory capacities, and to submit to regular check-ins with a social worker who monitored her compliance with restitution requirements. When our initial visit ended after 3 hours, nobody quite knew how to say goodbye. The emotional weight of what we'd all been through made casual pleasantries seem inadequate, but the uncertainty about our future relationships made deeper expressions of love or forgiveness feel premature. Emma hugged her mother again, longer this time, and promised to visit the following weekend. Marcus shook Patricia's hand formally, like a business transaction, which somehow felt more honest than forced affection. I managed a brief embrace, insisting she wanted to be present for whatever conversations or confrontations might occur. She'd been my anchor throughout this entire ordeal, helping me navigate legal complexities, financial recovery, and the emotional roller coaster of prosecuting my own child while caring for her children. David still had 6 months remaining on his sentence, and his attitude during recent phone calls suggested he hadn't experienced the same level of personal growth that Patricia claimed to have achieved. He remained focused on his legal appeals, convinced that his conviction was somehow unfair, despite the overwhelming evidence of his crimes. Emma joined us at the breakfast table after her run, her face flushed from exertion and the morning heat that was already building, even though it was only 7 o'clock. She'd been the most conflicted about her mother's impending release, torn between longing for family reunion and fear of being disappointed again by someone she'd once trusted completely. We'd all agreed that the initial meeting should take place at the halfway house, rather than bringing Patricia directly to my home, where Marcus and Emma had built new routines and a sense of security. Too much had changed for everyone to simply pretend we could pick up where we'd left off before the arrests. The drive to Tempe was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we hoped for and what we feared from this reunion. Marcus sat in the back seat, sketching in the art journal that had become his way of processing difficult emotions. Emma stared out the window at the familiar desert landscape, occasionally sighing in a way that reminded me so much of her mother at that age. Margaret navigated the Phoenix traffic while I tried to prepare myself mentally for seeing Patricia again. The woman being released today had written letters filled with accountability and remorse, but she was also the same person who had systematically stolen from me while looking me in the eyes and accepting my trust. Reconciling those two versions of my daughter felt almost impossible. The Haven House facility looked like a modest apartment complex surrounded by desert landscaping and security cameras. Patricia was waiting for us in the visitors' lobby, wearing civilian clothes that seemed to hang loosely on her frame. Prison had changed her physically in ways that shocked me. She looked older, thinner, with gray streaks in her hair that hadn't been there 18 months ago. When she saw Marcus and Emma, Patricia's composure crumbled immediately. She began crying before either child decided whether they wanted to hug her or maintain their distance. Emma approached first, offering a tentative embrace that gradually became more genuine as her mother whispered apologies into her hair. Marcus hung back initially, studying his mother's face as if trying to determine whether this display of emotion was authentic or performed for our benefit. When Patricia knelt down to his eye level and thanked him for being brave enough to tell the truth, even when it meant exposing her crimes, he seemed to make a decision about giving her another chance. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced as a mother or grandmother. Patricia spoke directly about her criminal behavior, acknowledging specific ways she'd violated my trust and damaged our family relationships. She didn't make excuses or blame circumstances beyond her control. Instead, she took full responsibility for choices she'd made over a 3-year period. She explained how the theft had started small, with her justifying minor unauthorized withdrawals as temporary loans she intended to repay quickly. But each successful theft made the next one easier to rationalize, and eventually she'd convinced herself that she was entitled to my money because she was helping with my daily needs and managing my household affairs. Patricia talked about the counseling sessions she'd attended in prison, group therapy with other women who had committed financial crimes against family members. She'd learned that elder abuse, simultaneously compassionate toward the woman who had raised 4 children and violated by the criminal who had betrayed my trust. The drive home was emotionally exhausting for all of us. Emma cried quietly in the passenger seat, processing complicated feelings about reconnecting with her mother while protecting herself from potential future disappointment. Marcus sketched more intensively in his journal, working through thoughts he wasn't ready to verbalize. Margaret and I discussed the visit once we were back at my house and the children had gone to their rooms. We both felt cautiously optimistic about Patricia's apparent growth and accountability. But we also acknowledged that 18 months of consequences couldn't undo 3 years of systematic deception and theft. The following weeks established a careful routine of supervised visits and monitored phone calls between Patricia and her children. Emma was more eager to rebuild their relationship, perhaps because she was old enough to understand that people could change while still being accountable for past mistakes. Marcus remained more guarded, not hostile but observant in ways that reminded me of the careful attention he'd paid to his parents' behavior before exposing their crimes. He seemed to be evaluating whether his mother's changed behavior was genuine or another form of manipulation designed to regain access to the family she'd damaged. Patricia's job at the nonprofit organization appeared to be going well, according to updates from her parole officer. She was working with women who had similar backgrounds of financial crimes and substance abuse, helping them navigate the practical challenges of rebuilding their lives after incarceration. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that Patricia was now helping other people overcome the same criminal behavior she'd engaged in herself. But her supervisor at the organization told me during a phone call that Patricia's personal experience with the consequences of financial abuse made her uniquely effective at helping other women understand the real impact of their choices. 3 months into Patricia's halfway house residency, we faced our first major test of her claimed rehabilitation. Emma had been accepted to a summer academic program at Arizona State University, a prestigious opportunity that would require significant tuition and living expenses that we hadn't budgeted for. In the past, Patricia would have immediately suggested borrowing against my assets or finding creative ways to access funds that weren't readily available. Instead, she researched scholarship opportunities, helped Emma write grant applications, and offered to take on extra shifts at her job to contribute toward the program costs. This response felt like the first genuine evidence that Patricia understood the difference between appropriate family financial support and the manipulative schemes she'd employed before her arrest. She was contributing her own labor and resources, rather than trying to access mine through deception or emotional manipulation. Emma's summer program became a bonding experience for our reconstructed family in unexpected ways. Patricia attended Emma's orientation sessions, helped her move into dormitory housing, and maintained regular contact throughout the program without overstepping boundaries or making demands for excessive attention. Marcus observed these interactions carefully, and I could see him gradually relaxing his defensive posture around his mother. He began sharing more details about his school activities and friendships during their weekly phone calls, though he still avoided topics related to finances or long-term family planning. The most significant breakthrough in our family healing came when Marcus decided to show Patricia some of his artwork from the journal he'd been keeping throughout her incarceration. The sketches and writings revealed the depth of his emotional processing and his sophisticated understanding of the moral complexities surrounding his decision to expose her crimes. Patricia spent nearly an hour looking through Marcus's journal, tears streaming down her face as she saw how her actions had affected her son's sense of security and trust. She told him she was proud of his courage in protecting me, even though it had meant betraying her criminal behavior to authorities. This conversation marked a turning point in Marcus's relationship with his mother. He began to see that she genuinely understood the position he'd been placed in, and respected his choice to prioritize protecting his grandmother over protecting his parents from the consequences of their crimes. As summer ended and Patricia's halfway house residency neared completion, we had to make decisions about living arrangements and ongoing family dynamics. Emma would be starting her junior year of high school, while Marcus was entering 8th grade. Both children had thrived during their time living with me, but they also missed having daily contact with their mother. Patricia had saved enough money from her job to rent a small apartment near the halfway house, and her parole officer had approved her transition to independent living. The question was whether Marcus and Emma would move back with her or continue living with me while maintaining regular visitation with their mother. After extensive family discussions and consultation with therapists who had been working with all of us throughout this process, We developed a flexible arrangement that prioritized the children's stability, while allowing for gradual rebuilding of their relationship with Patricia. Emma chose to spend weekdays with me during the school year, while living with Patricia on weekends and during school breaks. This arrangement gave her the academic stability she'd found in my household, while providing opportunities for regular mother-daughter bonding, without the pressure of full-time cohabitation. Marcus decided to continue living with me primarily, with overnight visits to Patricia's apartment twice a week and longer stays during school vacations. His decision seemed based on practical considerations about school consistency, rather than lack of forgiveness toward his mother. David's release from prison 6 months later presented different challenges, because his attitude during incarceration had shown less growth and accountability than Patricia's. His phone calls and letters continued to focus on legal grievances and complaints about his treatment rather than genuine remorse for his crimes or concern about their impact on his family. When David was released to a different halfway house in Mesa, the children's reactions were noticeably more guarded than they'd been toward Patricia's release. Emma agreed to visit him, but insisted that these meetings take place in public locations with other family members present. Marcus was even more cautious about reconnecting with his father. David had been the more aggressive architect of the financial fraud scheme, and his lack of apparent personal growth during incarceration made Marcus skeptical about his motivations for wanting to rebuild family relationships. The contrast between Patricia's and David's approaches to post-release family contact was stark. Patricia focused on earning forgiveness through consistent actions and transparent communication. David seemed to expect immediate restoration of family relationships based on having served his court-ordered sentence. David's first supervised visit with his children was awkward and tense. He spent most of the time complaining about prison conditions and legal expenses, rather than acknowledging the pain his crimes had caused or expressing genuine interest in Marcus and Emma's lives during his absence. Emma tried to engage with her father by sharing updates about school activities and friends, but David's responses were distracted and self-focused. Marcus barely spoke during the entire visit, answering direct questions politely, but offering no voluntary conversation or emotional engagement. After David left, Emma expressed frustration about the difference between her parents' attitudes toward family reconciliation. She said Patricia felt like someone who had learned from her mistakes and wanted to rebuild relationships, while David felt like someone who was going through the motions of family contact because it was expected. Marcus was more direct in his assessment. He said David seemed like the same person who had committed crimes against me, just temporarily inconvenienced by having faced consequences. He didn't trust that his father understood why his actions had been wrong, or that he wouldn't repeat similar behavior if given the opportunity. These observations from Marcus and Emma aligned with my own impressions of David's post-release attitude. While I remained open to the possibility of his genuine rehabilitation, I also implemented additional protective measures to ensure he couldn't gain unauthorized access to my finances or personal information. Patricia's response to David's release was complicated by her own ongoing recovery process and her commitment to maintaining the progress she'd made in rebuilding family relationships. She expressed concern about his influence on their children and his potential to undermine the trust she'd been working to restore. The legal requirements for David's restitution payments created ongoing tension because his employment prospects were limited by his criminal record. While Patricia had found meaningful work that utilized her skills and provided opportunities for personal growth, David struggled with basic job applications and interviews. His financial obligations for restitution, parole supervision, and basic living expenses exceeded his income from part-time warehouse work. This created pressure for him to seek additional family financial support, exactly the kind of request that raised red flags for everyone who had been affected by his previous crimes. When David approached me directly about temporary financial assistance, I declined politely but firmly. I explained that providing him with money would undermine the accountability process and potentially enable him to avoid developing genuine independence and responsibility for his financial obligations. David's reaction to my refusal was immediate anger, followed by accusations that I was being vindictive and preventing him from successfully reintegrating into society. His response confirmed my concerns about his attitude and reinforced my decision to maintain clear financial boundaries. Patricia supported my position when David complained to her about my refusal to help him financially. She told him that rebuilding trust required demonstrating reliability and independence, rather than seeking shortcuts or special treatment from the people he'd previously victimized. This disagreement between Patricia and David created additional stress in their own relationship as they navigated divorce proceedings that had been delayed during their incarceration. Patricia had filed for divorce shortly before David's release, citing irreconcilable differences related to their criminal behavior and its aftermath. The divorce process became contentious when David demanded joint custody of Marcus and Emma, despite his limited housing options and unstable employment situation. Patricia and I worked with family court advocates to ensure the children's best interests remained the priority in custody determinations. Emma, now 17 and legally able to express preferences about custody arrangements, made it clear she wanted minimal contact with David until he demonstrated genuine change in his attitude and behavior. She said she was willing to maintain a relationship with him but needed evidence that he understood and regretted the pain his actions had caused. Marcus, at 13, was more direct about his preferences. He told the court-appointed family advocate that he didn't trust his father and didn't want to spend overnight visits in his home until David showed real accountability for his crimes and their impact on the family. The custody evaluation process revealed David's continued lack of insight into his children's emotional needs and their reasons for maintaining distance from him. He interpreted their caution as manipulation by Patricia and me, rather than natural consequences of his own criminal behavior. Eventually, the court awarded Patricia primary custody of both children, with David receiving supervised visitation rights that could be expanded based on demonstrated stability and positive parenting behaviors. The arrangement protected Marcus and Emma while providing David with opportunities to rebuild relationships if he chose to address his attitude and behavior patterns. As we approached the second anniversary of Patricia and David's initial arrests, our family had developed new routines and relationships that reflected the realities of what we'd all experienced. Trust had been broken and was being rebuilt slowly, with clear boundaries and consistent accountability measures. Patricia continued working at the nonprofit organization and had been promoted to a supervisory position overseeing other women transitioning from incarceration. Her personal growth seemed genuine and sustained, supported by ongoing counseling and her commitment to financial transparency. Emma thrived academically and had been accepted to several colleges with substantial scholarship offers. Her resilience in overcoming family trauma while maintaining her educational goals impressed everyone who worked with her throughout this process. Marcus had grown into a remarkably mature young man who balanced empathy with healthy skepticism about people's motivations. His artwork had evolved to reflect themes of justice, courage, and the complexity of family relationships in ways that suggested he was processing his experiences constructively. David remained living in transitional housing and working part-time jobs, while struggling to meet his financial obligations. His relationship with his children was limited and strained, primarily due to his continued resistance to accepting full responsibility for his actions and their consequences. My own recovery involved not just financial restoration but emotional healing from the betrayal of discovering my daughter's crimes. Counseling helped me understand that protecting myself and seeking justice hadn't been selfish or vindictive, but necessary for preventing additional harm to myself and potentially other vulnerable people. The community response to our story had been supportive in ways I hadn't expected. Other families dealing with elder abuse reached out for advice and support. Several local organizations invited me to speak about recognizing warning signs and seeking help when family members engage in financial exploitation. Margaret remained actively involved in our family's ongoing recovery, providing practical support and emotional stability during difficult transitions. Her presence had been crucial in maintaining continuity for Marcus and Emma, while their parents dealt with the consequences of their criminal behavior. The financial recovery process had been largely successful, with most of the stolen funds returned through asset seizures and restitution payments. My credit score had been restored, fraudulent accounts had been closed, and security measures had been implemented to prevent future unauthorized access. Looking toward the future, our family faced ongoing challenges related to rebuilding relationships while maintaining appropriate boundaries and accountability measures. Patricia's continued growth and responsibility gave reason for cautious optimism about eventual full reconciliation. David's slower progress toward accepting responsibility and demonstrating genuine change meant that his reintegration into family relationships would require more time and substantial behavioral changes that might or might not occur. Marcus and Emma's resilience throughout this ordeal had been remarkable, but they would continue to need support in processing their experiences and developing healthy relationship patterns based on trust, honesty, and mutual respect, rather than manipulation and exploitation. The legal system had provided justice and accountability, but the emotional healing required ongoing commitment from everyone involved to prioritize honesty, respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being over short-term convenience or financial advantage. As I reflected on everything our family had experienced, I felt grateful for Marcus's courage in exposing the truth, proud of Emma's strength in navigating complex family dynamics, and hopeful about Patricia's genuine efforts to rebuild trust through consistent actions rather than empty promises. The pain of betrayal would always be part of our family history, but it had also revealed reserves of strength, integrity, and love that none of us had known we possessed. Marcus's decision to protect me had saved more than my financial security. It had preserved the possibility of authentic relationships based on truth rather than deception. 3 years had passed since that terrible morning when Marcus first played his parents' recorded conversation for me at my kitchen table. The boy who had courageously exposed his parents' crimes had grown into a 16-year-old young man whose quiet strength continued to inspire everyone around him. Emma had graduated from high school with honors and was thriving in her second year at Arizona State University, majoring in social work with a focus on family advocacy. The transformation in our family dynamics had been gradual but profound. Patricia had completed her parole supervision 6 months early due to exemplary compliance with all requirements and her continued employment at the nonprofit organization. She had been promoted again, now serving as the program director for women's financial literacy and family reunification services. Her apartment had become a place where Marcus felt comfortable spending extended time, and Emma visited regularly during school breaks. The relationship between Patricia and her children had evolved into something more honest and mature than it had been before her arrest. They spoke openly about the impact of her crimes and the ongoing work required to maintain trust and accountability. David's journey had taken a different path entirely. After struggling with employment and housing instability for over a year after his release, he had eventually violated his parole by failing to make required restitution payments and missing scheduled meetings with his supervision officer. He was currently serving an additional 18-month sentence, and his relationship with Marcus and Emma had deteriorated to occasional supervised phone calls. The children had made peace with their father's choices and limitations in ways that showed remarkable emotional maturity. Emma told me that she had learned to separate her love for David as her father from her disappointment in his continued refusal to take genuine responsibility for his actions. Marcus was more direct in his assessment, saying he had accepted that some people simply couldn't or wouldn't change, even when given multiple opportunities. My relationship with Patricia had required the most careful navigation of all the family dynamics we'd rebuilt. We had developed what I could only describe as cautious affection, grounded in respect for the growth she had demonstrated while maintaining awareness of the capacity for deception she had previously shown. She continued to provide complete financial transparency, sharing monthly statements from all her accounts and involving me in any major financial decisions that might affect the children. The legal requirement for restitution had been fulfilled completely, but Patricia had continued making voluntary payments that she calculated as interest on the money she had stolen. She said that mathematical restoration wasn't sufficient for emotional healing, and that she wanted to ensure I had additional financial security as compensation for the stress and uncertainty her crimes had caused. These extra payments had allowed me to establish college funds for Marcus and Emma that would cover their educational expenses without requiring student loans or family financial strain. Ironically, Patricia's efforts to make amends had provided her children with better educational opportunities than her original theft had been intended to secure. Marcus had developed into an exceptional student with particular talent in mathematics and computer science. His art had evolved as well, with several pieces being selected for display in local galleries that showcased young artists. His experiences with family trauma and recovery had given his work depth and emotional resonance that impressed art teachers and community members alike. More importantly, Marcus had become a confident advocate for other young people dealing with family dysfunction or abuse. He volunteered with a youth counseling program and had spoken at several community events about the importance of seeking help when adults in their lives were engaging in harmful behaviors. Emma's choice to study social work had been directly influenced by our family's experiences with the criminal justice system, family court processes, and social services interventions. She wanted to help other families navigate these complex systems and ensure that children's voices were heard and protected during family crises. Her academic work focused on the intersection of elder abuse and child welfare, examining how financial crimes against elderly family members often created instability and trauma for younger family members as well. Her professors praised her unique perspective and practical understanding of these issues based on her personal experiences. The community connections that had developed from sharing our story publicly had created an informal network of support for other families dealing with similar situations. I received regular calls and visits from people who had discovered financial abuse by family members and needed guidance about their options and resources. Detective Walsh had stayed in touch throughout the years following Patricia and David's convictions, occasionally consulting with me about other elder abuse cases where my experience might provide useful insights. She told me that the evidence Marcus had gathered continued to be referenced in training programs for law enforcement officers investigating financial crimes against vulnerable adults. The recording Marcus had made of his parents' conversation had been used in prosecution training seminars and had helped secure convictions in several similar cases across Arizona. His courage had protected not just me but potentially dozens of other elderly victims whose cases might not have been successfully prosecuted without the precedent his evidence had established. Margaret remained actively involved in our family's ongoing activities, having essentially become a second grandmother to Marcus and Emma. Her practical support during the crisis years had evolved into a treasured friendship that enriched all our lives. She had also become an advocate for elder protection services in her own community, sharing our story to help other seniors recognize warning signs of financial exploitation. My own perspective on family, trust, and forgiveness had been fundamentally changed by everything we had experienced. I had learned that love and accountability could coexist, that protecting yourself from harm wasn't selfish, even when the harm came from people you cared about deeply, and that genuine reconciliation required consistent actions over time rather than emotional appeals or promises. The house that had once felt like a refuge violated by betrayal had become a gathering place for our reconstructed family and the broader community of people who had supported us throughout our healing process. Marcus and Emma brought friends over regularly, comfortable in the knowledge that their home environment was stable and safe. Patricia visited for Sunday dinners most weeks, contributing her cooking skills and helping with household projects in ways that felt natural rather than obligatory. These visits had established new traditions and memories that coexisted with but didn't erase the painful history of her crimes and their consequences. The financial security that had been restored through legal processes and Patricia's ongoing restitution efforts had allowed me to focus on activities and relationships that brought meaning to my later years. I had resumed travel, including trips with Margaret to visit extended family and explore places Robert and I had always planned to see together. More significantly, I had found purpose in advocacy work related to elder protection and family financial abuse prevention. Speaking at community centers, senior housing facilities, and law enforcement training programs had given me opportunities to transform our painful experiences into tools for protecting other vulnerable people. The relationship between Marcus and Emma had been strengthened by their shared experiences of navigating family crisis and recovery. They supported each other's educational and personal goals, while maintaining individual friendships and interests that reflected their different personalities and developmental stages. Emma's upcoming college graduation would mark another milestone in our family's recovery and growth. Patricia would be attending the ceremony, along with Margaret and me, celebrating Emma's achievements while acknowledging how different our family structure had become from what any of us had originally envisioned. Marcus had expressed interest in studying criminal justice or forensic accounting in college, career paths that reflected his understanding of how financial crimes affected families and communities. His early exposure to these issues through his own family's crisis had given him unique insight into the intersection of law enforcement, family dynamics, and victim advocacy. Looking toward the future, our family faced the ongoing challenge of maintaining healthy relationships while preserving the lessons learned from our experiences with betrayal and recovery. The scars from Patricia's crimes would always be part of our family history, but they had also revealed strengths and values that might never have been discovered under different circumstances. Marcus's courage in exposing the truth had saved more than my financial security. It had preserved the possibility of genuine relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation, accountability rather than enablement, and mutual respect rather than exploitation. His decision to protect me had ultimately protected all of us from further harm, and created opportunities for authentic healing and growth. The story of our family's crisis and recovery had become a testament to the power of truth-telling, the importance of supporting vulnerable family members, and the possibility of rebuilding trust even after the most serious betrayals. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that age doesn't determine wisdom, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages about justice, integrity, and love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.